The introduction of the janitor Marcus woke up before the sun most mornings. His alarm clock rang at 4:30 a.m., and he sat at the edge of his bed for a few quiet moments before standing up. The old wooden floor creaked under his feet, reminding him of the age of the small apartment he lived in. He rubbed his hands together, the roughness of his palms telling the story of years of hard work. Marcus was a janitor at a martial arts academy. To many it was just another job, but for him it was a responsibility he carried with dignity. He had promised himself long ago that no matter what kind of work he did, he would always do it with pride. Whether he was cleaning classrooms, scrubbing bathrooms, or sweeping the floor of a dojo, he gave it the same attention and care. When Marcus arrived at the academy each morning, the air was cold and the streets were quiet. He liked those first hours of silence. He unlocked the front door, pushed his cart of cleaning supplies inside, and started his routine. He wiped down the mirrors that lined the walls of the dojo, making sure no streaks remained. He polished the trophies in the glass cabinet, letting them shine under the fluorescent lights. He swept the training mats carefully, not just once, but 3 times, so that no dirt or dust would be left behind for the students. By the time the first students arrived, the academy was spotless. To them, it always looked like that, as if it cleaned itself. Few ever thought about the man who worked behind the scenes to make it so. Most of the students barely noticed Marcus. He wore simple clothes, usually a faded sweatshirt and old sneakers. He kept his head down, focused on his work, but Marcus was always watching. As he swept, mopped, or carried trash bags out, he observed the students practicing. He noticed the way they bowed before stepping on the mat, the way they lined up according to rank, and the way they shouted in unison when their instructor called out commands. He listened to the rhythm of their strikes, the thud of their kicks against pads, and the slap of bodies hitting the mat during throws. He respected the discipline. He admired the dedication. Deep inside, something stirred whenever he saw them train. It was not jealousy, but a quiet recognition, like a distant memory knocking at the door of his heart. Marcus never spoke of it, but once upon a time he too had worn a gi and tied a belt around his waist. Once upon a time he had been on the mat, learning the same lessons these students now learned. Life, however, had taken him in another direction. Circumstances, responsibilities, and struggles had forced him to set aside that path. Cleaning became his job, and the dojo became the place where he worked, not the place where he trained. But the knowledge and the discipline he once carried never left him. They lived in his posture, in the calmness of his breathing, in the way he handled every task with focus and care. The students did not know this. To them, Marcus was just the janitor, a man whose only role was to pick up after others, a man who, in their eyes, had no connection to the proud world of martial arts. And yet there was something about him. Some students, the more observant ones, noticed the way Marcus moved. When he bent to pick something up, it was not clumsy but smooth, as if his body understood balance and flow. When he carried heavy bags of trash, his back was straight, his step steady. Even in silence, Marcus carried himself with a dignity that seemed out of place for someone in his role. But young eyes rarely look deep. They see what they want to see. Among the students, one name stood out more than others: Eric. He was the academy's star pupil, a young man with sharp skills and a sharp tongue. He wore his black belt like a crown, not just as a sign of discipline but as a symbol of superiority. His kicks were fast, his punches powerful, and his throws impressive. The instructors praised him often, and the other students followed his lead. Eric knew he was talented, and he carried himself with an air of arrogance. He spoke loudly, laughed at others' mistakes, and loved to show off. To him, martial arts was not about humility or self-control. It was about proving he was better than everyone else. Marcus had seen boys like Eric before. Confidence was good, but arrogance blinded. Discipline was meant to teach respect, but Eric wore his belt like armor against humility. Still, Marcus never interfered. It was not his place. He swept quietly as Eric bragged, polished trophies while Eric mocked weaker students, and mopped floors while Eric basked in attention. One evening, however, something shifted. The dojo was filled with students. They had just finished a tough sparring session, and sweat dripped down their faces. Eric had won his match easily, and he stood at the center, chest puffed, soaking in the admiration. Marcus entered quietly with his mop, intending to clean the floor after the session ended, but Eric's eyes found him. With a smirk, Eric pointed at Marcus. "Go clean," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. That's all you are. Laughter spread across the room. Some students chuckled nervously, not wanting to offend Eric. Others laughed openly, enjoying the joke. Marcus stood still, his hands tightening around the handle of his mop. His face did not change, but his silence spoke volumes. Inside, however, something stirred. Not anger, not shame, something deeper. It was the same knock at the door of his heart, the same reminder of who he once was. Eric, emboldened by the laughter, took a step closer. His smirk grew wider. Tell me, old man, he said mockingly, have you ever even been on the mat? Do you even know what real strength looks like? The students watched eagerly. For them, this was entertainment. For Eric, it was a chance to assert his dominance once again. For Marcus, it was a moment he had not asked for, but one he could no longer ignore. He set the mop aside gently, his eyes lifted, meeting Eric's for the first time. The room grew quiet, the laughter fading. Marcus did not speak. He did not need to. The calmness in his eyes, the steadiness of his posture, was answer enough. The janitor, who was invisible to them, had just stepped into the light. And though none of them knew it yet, what happened next would silence them all. The silence in the dojo stretched for a moment after Marcus set his mop aside. Everyone's eyes turned toward him, waiting to see what he would do. Eric stood tall in the middle, arms folded, his black belt hanging proudly at his waist. He had grown used to being the center of attention, and to him Marcus was nothing more than a prop for another performance. The janitor was not supposed to answer back, not supposed to carry himself with dignity, and certainly not supposed to meet his eyes with such calm strength. But Marcus did. That single act unsettled Eric more than he wanted to admit, so he doubled down on his arrogance. Come on, Eric said, his voice dripping with mockery. What are you staring at? Do you think you belong here? Do you think sweeping floors makes you part of us? He laughed loudly, and the sound echoed off the dojo walls. Some of the students joined in, but it was clear their laughter was weaker now, not as full as before. They felt the tension Marcus carried in his silence, though they did not understand it. Marcus did not answer. His stillness seemed to speak louder than words, and that bothered Eric even more. He stepped closer, his voice rising. Tell you what, he said, why don't you step on the mat? Let's see what you can do. Or are you too scared to even try? He looked around the room, feeding off the attention. This will be fun. A black belt against a janitor. We all know how that will end. The students chuckled, but again their voices carried hesitation. Deep down, many of them had felt uncomfortable when Eric insulted Marcus. They had grown up being taught that martial arts was about respect, humility, and discipline. But Eric's behavior often went against those principles. They excused it because he was talented, because he was strong, but seeing him turn his arrogance on the quiet janitor made them uneasy. Still, no one spoke up. They watched, waiting for Marcus to react. Marcus finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down and picked up the rag that hung from his cart. He folded it neatly and placed it on the handle. Then he straightened up and looked at Eric again. His face remained calm, his posture unshaken. I am here to work, Marcus said softly, his voice steady but carrying enough weight to be heard by all. Not to fight. Eric laughed again, but the sound rang hollow this time. Of course, he sneered, because you can't. Because you don't know how. You're nothing but a cleaner. That's all you'll ever be. Marcus turned back toward his cart as if to resume his work, but Eric was not satisfied. His pride demanded more. He could not let Marcus walk away with dignity, because that would mean his mockery had failed. Wait, Eric said sharply, stepping closer. If you refuse, everyone will know the truth. They'll know you're afraid. Afraid of me. Afraid of what will happen when you step on the mat. The students shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at each other, unsure if Eric had gone too far. The instructor, who usually kept order, was silent. He watched with curiosity, perhaps wanting to see what the quiet janitor would do. The room was thick with expectation. Marcus paused, his hand resting on the handle of his cart. For a long moment he stood still. Inside, memories stirred like old ghosts. He remembered the years when he trained, the mornings when he practiced before school, the tournaments where he fought not for glory but for survival. He remembered the sense of discipline, the lessons of humility, the respect for every opponent no matter their skill or background. He had left that life behind, or at least he thought he had. But Eric's arrogance had awakened something he could not ignore. Slowly, Marcus turned back to face Eric. His eyes were calm, his breathing steady. "Do you really want this?" he asked quietly. The room grew even quieter. The students leaned forward, sensing a change in the air. Eric smirked, mistaking Marcus's calmness for weakness. "Yes," he said firmly. "I want everyone to see what happens when a janitor thinks he can stand against a black belt." Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. He walked toward the edge of the mat, slipping off his old sneakers. His movements were deliberate, not rushed. He stepped onto the mat barefoot, his posture straight, his steps silent. The students watched with wide eyes. None of them had ever seen Marcus like this. For the first time, he looked as if he belonged there. Eric's smirk widened as he tied his belt tighter, ready to put on a show. "This won't take long," he said, raising his hands into a fighting stance. But as Marcus took his position across from him, something strange happened. His body shifted into balance with an ease that only years of training could give. His feet were grounded, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes focused but calm. It was not the stance of a beginner. It was not the awkward position of someone who had never been on a mat before. It was the stance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Whispers spread through the students. "He looks like he's trained," one murmured. "Do you see how steady he is?" another asked. Even the instructor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing in interest. Eric noticed too, but he brushed it off. "So he's seen a video or two," he said mockingly. "Doesn't matter. This is my dojo, my mat, my fight." He lunged forward quickly, throwing a strike meant to end things fast. Marcus moved like water, smooth, efficient, controlled. He stepped aside, letting the strike pass harmlessly, then placed a gentle hand on Eric's arm, redirecting his energy away. It was not an aggressive move. It was not meant to hurt, but it was enough to throw Eric off balance. He stumbled, regaining his footing with an embarrassed scowl. The students gasped. None of them had expected Marcus to react like that. Eric flushed with anger. "Lucky," he muttered. "Just lucky." He attacked again, faster this time, his movements sharp and powerful. Marcus flowed with each strike, dodging, redirecting, controlling. His body spoke the language of martial arts with a fluency no janitor was supposed to have. Eric grew frustrated. His attacks became sloppy, his arrogance blinding him to the truth unfolding before everyone's eyes. Marcus was not fighting to win. He was not fighting to prove himself. He was simply demonstrating control, skill, and restraint. His every movement reminded the students of the lessons they were supposed to learn: respect, humility, and discipline. Finally, Eric lunged recklessly, and Marcus responded with precision. He stepped aside, swept Eric's leg, and gently but firmly guided him to the mat. The sound of Eric hitting the ground echoed through the dojo. Marcus stood over him, calm and steady, not triumphant but composed. He extended his hand, offering to help Eric up. The room was silent. The students stared, their mouths slightly open. The arrogant black belt had been humbled by the man they had dismissed as just a janitor. Eric hesitated, pride warring with reality, but eventually he took Marcus's hand. Marcus pulled him up with ease. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. "Strength without respect is weakness," he said. No one laughed. No one mocked. The dojo was filled with a silence deeper than any shout. For the first time, they saw Marcus not as the man who cleaned their floors, but as someone who carried a strength they did not understand. And in that silence, a lesson was planted in every heart, one that would not be forgotten. The dojo was still wrapped in silence after Marcus helped Eric up, but the quiet did not last long. Whispers began to spread among the students, filling the air like ripples in water. No one had expected the janitor, the man they barely noticed most days, to move with such skill. Their eyes darted between him and Eric, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Some looked amazed, others confused, and a few even uncomfortable, as if what they had believed about Marcus had been shattered in front of them. Eric stood beside Marcus, his chest rising and falling as he tried to control his breathing. His pride burned hotter than the sting of hitting the mat. He glanced around the room and saw the doubt in the eyes of the other students. Doubt directed not at Marcus but at him, the black belt, the supposed star of the academy. The humiliation twisted in his chest like a knife. He pulled his hand from Marcus's grasp and straightened his belt as if the gesture could restore his dignity. "That was nothing," Eric muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A trick. Anyone can get lucky once." His voice lacked the same confidence it had carried minutes ago, but he forced it out, clinging to his arrogance as if it were armor. Marcus did not respond. He looked at Eric for a moment, then quietly stepped back, his posture calm and controlled. To him, the exchange was already over. He had not meant to humiliate Eric, only to remind him of respect. But Eric could not let go. His pride demanded more. Again, Eric snapped. This time, no holding back. Let's see what you really have. The students shifted uneasily. Some of them wanted Marcus to refuse, to simply walk away and return to his cart, because the idea of seeing their arrogant leader humbled again made them nervous. Others leaned forward, eager to see more of what Marcus could do, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Marcus studied Eric quietly. He could see the anger in the young man's face, the desperation to prove himself, the unwillingness to accept what had already happened. For Marcus, the decision was not about pride, but about principle. He had lived enough years to know that sometimes a lesson had to be repeated before it could be understood. Very well, Marcus said softly, his voice steady. The words sent a wave of energy through the room. Students straightened their backs, eyes locked on the two men. Even the instructor, who had been watching silently, leaned forward, his arms crossed tightly as if bracing himself for what was about to unfold. Eric charged first, moving with speed and aggression. His strikes came fast, his kicks sharp, his body twisting with practiced skill. But skill without control is like fire without boundaries, and Eric's movements burned with reckless pride. Marcus, in contrast, moved with ease. His steps were measured, his body balanced, his eyes calm. He did not attack. He responded. He let Eric's energy flow around him, redirecting it, guiding it, showing the students a level of mastery they had never seen before. Again and again, Eric lunged, and again, Marcus countered with simple, precise movements. He blocked without force, dodged without panic, redirected without hesitation. Every time Eric thought he had an opening, Marcus was already a step ahead, as if he could see the future of each strike before it landed. The students gasped with each failed attempt. The whispers grew louder, their disbelief turning into awe. "He's incredible," one muttered. "How does he know all this?" Another asked. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and powerful. Marcus was no ordinary janitor. Eric's frustration grew. Sweat dripped down his face, his breath quickened, his movements became sloppy. Pride had blinded him, and the harder he tried, the more obvious it became that Marcus was not just surviving, he was teaching. Finally, Marcus shifted. For the first time, he moved forward with intention. His strike was not aggressive but controlled, a demonstration rather than an attack. He stepped into Eric's space, guiding his arm downward, sweeping his leg, and with a smooth motion placed Eric on the mat once again. This time the move was even more decisive, leaving no room for doubt. The dojo fell silent once more. Eric lay on the mat staring up at the ceiling, his pride shattered. Marcus stood above him, steady and calm, his chest rising evenly with controlled breaths. He did not gloat, did not smile, did not celebrate. Instead, he simply stepped back and allowed Eric to rise again. "Why?" Eric finally shouted, his voice breaking the silence. "Why are you doing this? You're just a janitor. You shouldn't be able to—" His words caught in his throat. He looked around at the students, their eyes wide with admiration, not for him, but for Marcus. The weight of it crushed him. Marcus looked at him, his gaze deep but gentle. "Respect," he said simply. "Respect for yourself. Respect for others. Without it, your belt means nothing." The words landed heavier than any strike. The students shifted uncomfortably, some nodding slowly, others bowing their heads in silent agreement. Even the instructor's expression softened, his eyes lingering on Marcus with a new recognition. Eric clenched his fists, torn between anger and shame. For so long he had believed that his belt made him untouchable, that his skill set him above others, but in a matter of minutes Marcus had shown him, and everyone else, that true strength had nothing to do with arrogance. It was about discipline, humility, and respect. The tension in the dojo slowly faded, replaced by a heavy silence filled with thought. Marcus quietly stepped off the mat, slipped his old sneakers back on, and returned to his cart. He picked up his rag and resumed his work as if nothing had happened. To him it was over. The lesson had been given, but for the students it was only the beginning. They could not look at Marcus the same way again. The man they had ignored, the man they had mocked, had revealed himself as something far greater than they ever imagined. And though he went back to cleaning the floors, They now saw him as the man who had silenced arrogance with dignity, who had shown them the true meaning of martial arts without raising his voice. For Eric, the weight of humiliation burned hotter than ever. His pride had been wounded, his image tarnished. But deep inside, beneath the anger and shame, something else began to stir. A seed had been planted, though he did not yet recognize it. The seed of respect. The night ended quietly. Marcus finished his cleaning, gathered his supplies, and left the dojo as he always did. But the air inside remained heavy, charged with the memory of what they had witnessed. The students would whisper about it for days, their voices carrying the story of the janitor who moved like a master. And while Eric struggled to accept what had happened, everyone else began to realize that strength could wear many faces, and sometimes the greatest lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. The dojo felt different the next day. Students walked in with their usual chatter, but their voices were quieter, their steps slower, and their eyes wandered more often toward the man who was already there, pushing his mop across the mats. Marcus did not look any different than he had before. He wore the same worn sweatshirt, the same sneakers, the same quiet expression, but to the students he was no longer invisible. They watched him with curiosity, their whispers following him as he moved. Eric arrived later than usual. His pride was still bruised, and the memory of being thrown to the mat by the janitor haunted him. The humiliation clung to him like a shadow he could not shake. He tried to walk in with his usual confidence, his black belt tied tightly around his waist, his chin lifted high, but even he noticed the difference in the way the students looked at him. Their respect had shifted, and it burned. The instructor gathered the class as always, his voice steady as he called them to line up. They bowed, began their drills, and went through the rhythm of training. But the energy was off. Distraction buzzed through the air. Their eyes kept sliding toward Marcus, sweeping the far corner, his movements deliberate, his back straight. It was as if everyone was waiting for something more, as if the air itself expected him to reveal another hidden piece of himself. Eric noticed it too, and it made him restless. After practice, as the students stretched and packed their bags, Eric walked to the center of the mat. His voice rang out sharp with frustration. Yesterday meant nothing, he declared. Anyone can look good once, but real fighters prove themselves again and again. And if he pointed at Marcus, thinks he can pretend to be one of us, let him prove it. The room froze. The students exchanged nervous glances, unsure if Eric was being brave or foolish. The instructor's brow furrowed, his arms crossing as he studied Marcus in the corner. The janitor stopped mopping, slowly straightened, and turned. His calm eyes met Eric's, and for a moment no one breathed. Enough, Marcus said quietly. His voice was not angry, not defensive, but filled with a quiet authority that caught everyone off guard. You asked once and I answered. That should be enough, but Eric would not stop. You think you taught me a lesson, he spat. You think one trick makes you better? I'm not done. I want everyone to see the truth, that you're just a man who cleans floors. Nothing more. The tension in the dojo thickened. The students leaned forward, waiting, torn between wanting Marcus to walk away and wanting him to reveal more of the mystery that surrounded him. Even the instructor said nothing, his silence a kind of permission. Marcus sighed softly. He had not wanted this. His life had been built on moving quietly, staying unseen, carrying his dignity in silence. But sometimes silence was mistaken for weakness, and sometimes a lesson required more than words. He set aside his mop and walked slowly to the edge of the mat. I did not come here to fight, Marcus said as he removed his sneakers. I came here to work. But since you insist, let me tell you something you do not know. The students leaned closer. Even Eric's arrogance wavered for a moment as curiosity flickered in his eyes. I was not always a janitor, Marcus continued, his voice steady. Years ago, I was a student like you. I wore a gi. I trained every day. I competed in tournaments not because I wanted trophies, but because I had to prove to myself that I could survive. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. I was not the strongest, not the fastest, but I learned. I learned discipline. I learned humility. And I learned that respect is the belt you cannot earn. It must be lived. The students' eyes widened. Their whispers spread through the room like sparks. None of them had ever imagined that Marcus had once been a martial artist. They had only seen the mop, the cart, the quiet steps. Now, a new picture formed in their minds. A younger Marcus, standing on mats like these, training, sweating, fighting, learning. Eric frowned, his pride clashing with the truth he was hearing. "If that's true," he said sharply, "then show us. Show us you're not just telling stories." Marcus studied him. His silence stretched long enough that the students held their breath. Then finally he nodded. "If that is what you need to understand, then I will show you." The instructor stepped forward now, his voice calm but carrying authority. "If this is to happen, it will be a demonstration. Not a fight for pride, but a lesson for all. Do you understand?" Eric nodded quickly, eager to prove himself. Marcus gave a quiet nod as well, his calm never wavering. They faced each other again. The students formed a wide circle around the mat, their eyes fixed on the two men. This time the air carried not just curiosity, but respect for Marcus, for the quiet man who was revealing his past piece by piece. Eric moved first, fast and aggressive, his strikes sharp with the frustration of his wounded pride. But Marcus flowed like water, his body relaxed yet precise. He did not strike to hurt. He demonstrated. Each block was gentle yet firm, each step smooth, each counter a reminder of his skill. His movements carried the weight of years, the discipline of a man who had once lived this life fully. The students gasped, their awe growing with every exchange. Marcus was not just holding his own, he was teaching. His every movement showed control, mastery, and respect. Eric's attacks grew desperate, fueled by pride, but Marcus never lost his calm. Finally, with a swift but controlled motion, Marcus redirected Eric's strike, guided him to the ground, and held him there with a restraint that spoke louder than victory. He released him instantly, stepping back with quiet dignity. The room erupted in whispers, then silence. The students stared, their respect for Marcus now undeniable. Eric sat on the mat, his pride broken, his breath heavy. Marcus looked around the room, his gaze gentle but firm. "Do not mistake silence for weakness," he said softly. "Do not mistake humility for lack of strength. Everyone you meet carries a story you do not know. Respect them, always." The words sank deep, reaching further than any strike could. The students bowed their heads, some in shame, some in admiration. Even the instructor bowed slightly, acknowledging Marcus not as a janitor but as a master of discipline and respect. Marcus stepped off the mat, put on his sneakers, and returned to his cart. He picked up his mop and resumed his work as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. From that day, the students no longer saw Marcus as the man who cleaned their floors. They saw him as the man who carried wisdom in his silence, a man whose past was etched into every graceful movement, a man who reminded them that strength was not about arrogance, but about dignity. And though Marcus did not seek recognition, he had found it, etched not in trophies or belts, but in the hearts of those who now watched him with newfound respect. The dojo had never felt so alive with silence. The night after Marcus revealed his past, the students returned with a new energy. They no longer looked at him as the man who mopped the floors or emptied the trash. Their eyes followed his every movement, searching for pieces of the mystery they had overlooked for so long. Yet Marcus himself had not changed. He arrived on time, pushed his cart to its usual corner, and quietly set about his work. His humility was disarming. He carried himself with the same calmness as before, as if the moments on the mat had been nothing more than a breath in a long day. But for the students, it was unforgettable. They whispered to one another about how Marcus had moved, about how he had placed Eric on the ground with ease, about how his words had carried more weight than the black belt around anyone's waist. Even the instructor seemed more thoughtful, his eyes resting on Marcus with a kind of respect no one had seen before. Eric, however, could not let it go. His pride was wounded deeper than he could admit. For years he had been the best in the dojo, the one everyone admired, the one who drew attention like a flame draws moths. Now, in a matter of moments, Marcus had stolen that light without even trying. Eric replayed the scenes in his mind, the gasps of the students, the silence when Marcus spoke. It gnawed at him, leaving him restless and bitter. By the end of the week, Eric's frustration reached its breaking point. He approached the instructor privately, his voice sharp with determination. "I want another chance," he demanded. "Not just a demonstration, a real fight. Let me prove myself." The instructor regarded him quietly. "Eric," he said, his voice calm, "what Marcus showed you was not about winning or losing. It was about respect. You should be learning from him, not challenging him." But Eric shook his head stubbornly. If I don't fight him properly, everyone will always think he's better. They'll think a janitor humiliated me.
I can't accept that. The instructor studied him for a long moment, then sighed.
Very well, if Marcus agrees. But if this happens, it must be with honor, not arrogance. When the instructor approached Marcus, he found the janitor wiping down the mirrors in quiet concentration. Eric has asked for another match, he said softly. This time a real fight. Marcus paused, lowering the cloth slowly. His reflection stared back at him in the polished glass, a face lined with years of labor and patience. He did not answer immediately. After a moment, he turned to the instructor. If this will help him understand, Marcus said, then I will do it. But I will not fight to defeat him. Only to teach, word spread quickly. By the evening, the dojo was filled to the corners. Students who rarely stayed late lingered, eager to witness what would unfold. Even parents and visitors crowded in, curious about the janitor whose quiet strength had shaken the pride of the academy's star. The air buzzed with anticipation, heavy with expectation. Marcus stepped onto the mat with the same calmness as before. His sweatshirt hung loosely on his shoulders, his posture steady, his eyes quiet. Eric stood across from him, his black GI freshly pressed, his belt tied tight, his jaw clenched. His pride demanded redemption, and his body trembled with the weight of it. The instructor raised his hand. This is not for glory, he reminded them all. This is not for belts or trophies. This is for respect. He looked at Eric, then at Marcus. Begin, Eric exploded forward. His strikes were fast, sharp, and filled with power. He moved with the desperation of a man trying to reclaim something slipping from his grasp. His fists cut the air, his kicks slammed against the mat, each move designed to overwhelm. But Marcus was ready. He did not fight with aggression. He fought with control. His steps were small but precise, his hands calm, his body flowing like a river that could not be forced. He absorbed Eric's energy, redirected it, turned it back on him without ever raising his voice or breaking his calm. The students gasped as the battle unfolded. It was not a one-sided demonstration this time. Eric's strikes were real, his intent fierce, but Marcus countered with a mastery that seemed almost effortless. Every movement told a story, of years spent learning, of discipline that never faded, of strength that came not from arrogance but from humility. Eric lunged again, aiming a powerful kick at Marcus's chest. Marcus sidestepped with fluid ease, caught Eric's leg, and with a smooth motion guided him off balance. Eric hit the mat hard, the sound echoing through the dojo. Gasps erupted, but Marcus did not press the advantage. He stepped back, giving Eric space to rise. His calm eyes never wavered, his posture steady, as if reminding everyone that this was not about dominance. Eric pushed himself up, his pride burning hotter with every failure. He charged again, his movements reckless now, his frustration pouring out in wild strikes. Marcus dodged, blocked, redirected. And then, with a final decisive motion, Marcus swept Eric's legs from beneath him and placed him on the mat once more, this time holding him there with firm control. The dojo fell silent. Eric struggled, but Marcus's hold was unbreakable, not because of brute force, but because of perfect technique. Marcus leaned close enough for only Eric to hear. Calm yourself, he said softly. This is not about who is stronger. It is about who can respect the lesson. Slowly, Marcus released him and stood. Eric lay on the mat, his chest heaving, his pride shattered beyond repair. For the first time, tears stung his eyes, not from pain, but from the weight of realization. He had been wrong. His arrogance had blinded him, and Marcus had opened his eyes without cruelty, only truth. The students rose to their feet, the silence breaking into a wave of applause. Not the wild cheers of a tournament, but a deep, respectful clapping that carried gratitude more than excitement. They had seen something greater than victory. They had seen humility overcome arrogance. Marcus bowed his head slightly, acknowledging their respect, then stepped off the mat. He put his sneakers back on, walked to his cart, and picked up his rag as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To him, it was simply another lesson, another chance to remind others of what truly mattered. But to the students, it was unforgettable. They would talk about it for years, remembering the night the janitor fought with the grace of a master, the night humility silenced pride. Eric sat quietly on the mat, his fists unclenched at last, his breathing slowing. For the first time, he understood. His belt had made him arrogant, but Marcus had reminded him that strength without respect was emptiness. He bowed his head, the weight of his lesson heavy but necessary, and in that moment the dojo was changed forever. The dojo never looked the same again after that night. Something had shifted in the air, something that could not be erased. For the students, the mats where they trained now held a deeper meaning. They had witnessed a fight that was not about glory, not about belts or trophies, but about truth. They had seen strength wrapped in humility, and they could no longer separate those two ideas. They whispered about Marcus in the days that followed, not with mockery or dismissal, but with awe and curiosity. Every time he pushed his cart across the room, every time he bent down to mop the mats, they watched him differently. Respect had replaced laughter. Eric was the most changed of all. For years he had carried himself like a king of the dojo. He had believed his black belt set him above everyone, a crown no one could challenge. But Marcus had shattered that illusion. The memory of being placed on the mat, held firmly yet gently, repeated in his mind over and over. At first it burned with humiliation, but slowly it became something else. He began to see it not as shame, but as a gift. Marcus had not humiliated him, he had taught him. And the more Eric thought about it, the more he realized that the lesson was not just about fighting. It was about life. One evening, after most of the students had gone home, Eric stayed behind. He stood by the trophy case, staring at the golden figures frozen in perfect poses, their shine catching the light. He thought about how much he had wanted his name etched on those trophies, how badly he had wanted recognition. And then he thought of Marcus, who had never asked for recognition, who had carried dignity quietly in his silence. The contrast struck him deeply. He turned and saw Marcus wiping down the mirrors with his rag, moving with the same calm patience as always. For a moment, Eric hesitated. Pride still tugged at him, warning him against lowering himself. But humility pressed harder, urging him to do what he had never done before. He walked across the mat and stopped in front of Marcus. "Sir," Eric said quietly. The word felt heavy on his tongue, but it carried sincerity. Marcus looked at him, his rag still in hand, his expression calm. "Yes?" Eric swallowed, his voice low but steady. "I was wrong. About you. About everything. I thought respect came from belts, from strength, from winning. But you showed me I was wrong." His eyes lowered, shame pulling at his chest. "I am sorry." The dojo was empty, but the words filled the room with a weight greater than any applause. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "It takes strength to fight," he said softly. "But it takes greater strength to admit when you are wrong." Eric lifted his eyes slowly. For the first time, he saw Marcus not as a janitor, not as a rival, but as a teacher. The humility in Marcus's gaze carried more power than all the trophies in the case. The days that followed marked the beginning of change. Eric trained differently. He no longer barked orders at the younger students or laughed when they stumbled. Instead, he encouraged them. He bowed deeper before sparring. He spoke less, listened more. The arrogance that once defined him began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to live up to the lesson Marcus had given him. The students noticed. At first, they were surprised by Eric's shift, whispering about how the star had been humbled. But over time, they began to follow his lead. They trained harder, not out of competition, but out of respect. They looked to Marcus not for words, but for example. And Marcus, true to himself, never sought to be their leader. He continued sweeping, wiping, polishing, carrying himself with the same steady dignity. Yet his presence became a silent lesson in every corner of the dojo. Even the instructor felt it. One evening, he approached Marcus quietly. "I have taught these students many things," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But what you have shown them in a few days has reached further than years of training. You remind us all of what this place is meant to stand for." Marcus only smiled faintly and shook his head. "I am just a man doing my work," he said. But the instructor knew better. As weeks passed, the story of Marcus spread beyond the dojo. Parents whispered about the janitor who had humbled the star pupil. Visitors asked curious questions. Some even came just to catch a glimpse of him, though Marcus never sought attention. To him, life remained the same. He woke before dawn, walked to the academy, cleaned the floors, polished the mirrors, and worked quietly until his shift was done. But to everyone else, his presence carried new meaning. One night, after another long day of training, the students gathered around Marcus without planning it. They watched him put away his cleaning supplies, and one of the younger students finally spoke. "Sir," the boy asked shyly, "will you teach us? Not in class, just teach us what you know." Marcus looked at their hopeful faces. He hesitated, then gave a gentle smile. "I can show you a few things," he said. "But remember, what matters most is not what you can do with your fists, but what you carry in your heart." So, after the lights dimmed and the official class ended, Marcus would sometimes step onto the mat. He would show them simple movements, teach them balance, explain how to breathe with control, how to move with calmness. His lessons were quiet, humble, and filled with wisdom. He never lectured. He simply demonstrated, letting them see discipline in his every motion. The students loved it. They began to understand martial arts in a way they had never before. For them, it was no longer just about earning belts or winning tournaments. It was about respect, patience, and humility. Eric trained alongside them. No longer the arrogant leader, but a student again, eager to learn. He often stayed late, watching Marcus with deep respect, knowing that the greatest fight he had ever faced was not against an opponent, but against his own pride. One evening, as the last student left and the dojo grew quiet, Eric approached Marcus again. "You changed me," he said honestly. "Before you, I thought strength was about being better than everyone else. Now I see it's about lifting others up. I don't know how to thank you." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, firm but kind. "Live the lesson," he said. "That will be thanks enough." The words stayed with Eric, etched in his mind like a vow. And so the dojo became different, not because Marcus sought to change it, but because he lived his truth openly. His lesson of respect became the silent heartbeat of the academy, guiding not just Eric but every student who stepped through its doors. What had begun as mockery had turned into transformation. What had begun as arrogance had become humility, and what had begun as silence had become a voice louder than any shout. The dojo had grown quieter in its spirit, though never weaker. It was not the silence of boredom or emptiness, but the silence of respect, the kind that filled the air after wisdom was spoken. Weeks passed, then months, and yet the presence of Marcus continued to shape everyone inside those walls. The janitor, once ignored, had become the silent heartbeat of the academy. Students who had once laughed at him now bowed deeper when they stepped on the mat. Parents who had once barely noticed him now greeted him warmly at the door. The dojo was still a place of training, but it had become something more, because Marcus had given it his truth. Eric, the young man who had once mocked him, was no longer the same. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a humility that surprised even his closest friends. He trained harder than before, but he no longer did it to show off. His movements became focused, his words softer, his attitude patient. He corrected younger students without mocking them, praised their progress, and pushed himself not to be the loudest, but to be the most respectful. He had learned the hard way that belts could be tied around the waist, but respect had to be tied around the heart. Sometimes after class, Eric stayed behind and asked Marcus quiet questions. "How do you stay so calm?" he asked one evening. Marcus, polishing the mirrors, answered simply, "Because anger clouds the mind. Calmness clears it." Another time Eric asked, "How do you know when to fight?" Marcus paused before responding, "When fighting is the last choice, not the first." These conversations stayed with Eric, guiding him not just on the mat, but in life. The students too found themselves drawn to Marcus. They began to see him as more than the man who cleaned. He became a quiet teacher, though he never called himself one. They would watch the way he carried his body, balanced even while pushing a heavy cart, or how his breathing stayed steady during long hours of work. He taught them without lectures, without strict drills, but by example. His very presence was a lesson, one they absorbed simply by being near him. The instructor, a man who had taught martial arts for decades, often found himself reflecting on Marcus's words. One night after locking up, he walked alongside Marcus. "You know," he said, "I've spent years trying to teach these children discipline, but in just a few weeks you've given them something deeper. You've reminded them of the soul of this art." Marcus only shook his head gently. "I haven't given them anything they didn't already have," he said. "I only reminded them to see it." The instructor smiled faintly. "And that is why they respect you." Life moved on, yet the story of Marcus spread quietly. Students told their families, who told their friends. Soon people outside the academy had heard whispers of the janitor who had humbled the black belt, who had shown that true strength had nothing to do with rank or title. Some came to the dojo hoping to see him, to witness the man whose calmness had silenced pride. But Marcus never sought the spotlight. He worked quietly, lived simply, and carried his dignity without fanfare. One particular evening stood out. The dojo was crowded, and a group of new students had just joined. Among them was a boy no older than 10, shy and nervous. He tripped often, his movements clumsy, and some of the older kids chuckled at his mistakes. Marcus, sweeping near the edge, noticed. After class, he walked over to the boy. "You did well today," he said softly. The boy looked up, surprised. "But I kept falling," he muttered. Marcus smiled. "Falling is not failing. Every time you fall, you rise again. That is where the strength is." The boy's eyes lit up with hope, and from that day he trained with new determination. The laughter of others no longer hurt him. He remembered Marcus's words, and he stood taller each time he stumbled. Years later, that same boy would tell others that the janitor's encouragement had kept him from giving up. And he carried that lesson into every challenge of his life. Eric, too, carried Marcus's lessons beyond the dojo. At school, when he saw others being mocked, he stepped in, not with arrogance, but with quiet strength. At home, he listened more to his parents, appreciating their sacrifices. He began to understand that respect was not just for the dojo, it was for everyone, everywhere. His transformation was so clear that his friends asked him what had changed. He always gave the same answer. "A janitor taught me what strength really means." One evening, as the dojo lights dimmed and the last echoes of training faded, the students gathered around Marcus without being asked. They bowed to him. Not as a janitor, not even as a fighter, but as a teacher. Marcus looked at them surprised, his rag still in hand. "Why do you bow to me?" he asked softly. A young girl answered, her voice steady. "Because you showed us respect is the belt we cannot see, but the one that matters most." For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had never wanted recognition, but in their eyes he saw something greater than praise. He saw understanding. The lesson he had carried quietly for years had finally taken root. As he walked home that night, the streets quiet under the glow of streetlights, Marcus thought about the journey that had led him here. Life had not been easy. He had faced hardships, disappointments, and responsibilities that had pulled him away from his old dreams. But perhaps it was never about trophies or titles. Perhaps it was always about this, the chance to remind others that dignity and respect were the true marks of strength. In time, the dojo would earn a reputation, not just for producing skilled fighters, but for producing students who carried themselves with humility and honor. And though Marcus never stood at the front of the class, his influence shaped them all. His legacy was not written on certificates or belts, but in the character of those he had touched. For Eric, the lesson would last a lifetime. He would go on to become an instructor himself one day, known not for arrogance but for patience, kindness, and wisdom. And whenever his students asked him where he had learned the true meaning of martial arts, he would smile and say, "From a man who swept the floors, but lifted everyone higher than they knew they could go." And so Marcus remained the janitor. Each morning he unlocked the doors, polished the mirrors, swept the mats, and pushed his cart quietly through the dojo. To many he was still the man who cleaned, but to those who knew the truth he was something far greater. He was a reminder that strength is not measured in belts or trophies, but in the respect we give, the dignity we carry, and the humility with which we live.